I hate to think how many people my guests have killed among them. But I can explain that. With fear very big these days, and with Halloween and all that, we thought it might be good to get together some of the people who produce horrible books and movies. That doesn't sound very complimentary. That might have been worded better. But they have scared all of us at some time or other. And I would like to introduce to you now these gentlemen who specialize in fear and horror and terror, either on the printed page or on the screen. Will you welcome first the author of Carrie and The Shining, Mr. Stephen King, and next to him the director of the cult classic films Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead, Mr. George Romero, the author of Rosemary's Baby, The Stepford Wives, Boys from Brazil, the play Death Trap, Mr. Ira Levin, and finally the man who wrote Ghost Story, Julia, not to be confused with Lillian Hellman's Julia, and a new book called Shadowland, Mr. Peter Straub. That's our group. There's several ways to go at this. We could all tell scary stories or talk about where they come from. If I were to say, what's the worst thing that you've ever done, would that ring a bell with at least one of you? Can somebody explain that? Get me off that hook.
I use that as the start of a novel called Ghost Story. And it's keyed into a group of older men who tell stories about the worst thing they ever did or the worst thing that ever happened to them. And the ghost story evolves from that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what is the appeal? Do you know? Is it worth analyzing, or should we just say it's just fun to be scared? Have you given any thought to why horror is something people willingly subject themselves to?
I think it's fun. I think people enjoy seeing a horror film or reading a scary book the way they enjoy going into a laugh in the dark or on a roller coaster ride. You go in knowing, or you go in with high expectations. And I think the ones that work on that audience are the ones that really pay off. In other words, the ones that give you that little zets and give you that involuntary response, reaction to it that you went in hoping to get.
I think something else that horror does is society gives points, you know, for good emotional behavior. So we get points for exercising those emotional muscles that society approves of: love, friendship, loyalty, humor, that sort of thing. But for every one of those good emotions, we have a dark one as well. We have fear, we have aggressiveness, we have anger, we all have, I suppose, urges that sometimes tend towards sadism, that sort of thing. And a horror story or a horror movie gives us a chance to exercise that side in a comparatively harmless way.
Exorcised?
Exorcised. Yeah.
Do you fellows happen to specialize in this field and could just as easily be in another one? Or if not, then mustn't you be weird in some way?
I don't know, I work at a car wash, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, I really wonder about that. I was trying to think of a tactful way to put it. But,
I don't think we're any more weird
I think
than
Steve
the
is
people
weird.
who enjoy the things we produce. I think it's the same thing. We're just producers and they're consumers, but we're subject to the same emotions and working
but
with
there has to
them.
be some real reason that you're in this field and not another one.
Well, I think you have a predilection toward it.
Yeah.
Ira Levin and I discovered that as children, we entertained other children by telling ghost stories to them. And so it was there, and I think I made mine up, but I'm sure he made his up. And it was just a way of exercising our imaginations that we came to very young.
I was warped as a child. There's a lot of horror comics in my past and a lot of horror movies and that sort of thing, and it warped me as a kid. And
Seriously?
Yeah, seriously warped me. And the thing is, I think that see, they know. In the world as it is today, though, I think if you don't have a few warps in your record, you can't get along. And that's one of the great appeals that the horror story has. There's been a lot of analysis a lot of it almost ludicrous, it seems to me, about horror in the wake of the big hits like George's Dawn of the Dead and Ghost Story and The Shining and all of that sort of thing. And really, I think what a lot of it is a sort of harmless blow-off for anxieties and bad feelings.
Yeah. Where would we have seen your warpedness if we'd known you earlier, before you began?
I get rid of most of it through this sort of thing. People say, well, do you have bad dreams? And the answer is no. I give them all to somebody else. I sleep well. And it works that way for the writer, I think, or the filmmaker as well, I guess. There's a kind of blow-off. And
if you didn't have that blow-off, would you be haunting graveyards and
Graveyards might be haunting you. I think you're tapping another emotion. I mean, I've often felt that to some extent with me it was accident. There were genre films that I loved of all different types. I love jungle movies. And had my first hit been a jungle movie, I might be a great jungle movie maker. But so to that extent it was accidental. And but I think there's a list of those involuntary emotions. Laughter, if you can make an audience laugh, cry, startle. Those are the things that you're really trying to do, and that's what you're sort of honing your work down to try to accomplish, to get that involuntary response out. And it's those involuntary responses that make people say, gee, that was great. But when people say about Salem's Lot, geez, I loved it, they're basically saying it scared the hell out of me. It's clear cut. They don't, you know, it's basically a different response that you get from a reader that read Salem's Lot or Rosemary's Baby than you get from a reader that read The Winds of War. If you ask someone, did you like The Winds of War, they'll go into 10 minutes about, you know, but if you ask someone, did you like Rosemary's Baby, what they immediately respond to is, yeah, it scared me. What they mean is, it scared me.
Yeah, but I think it goes beyond that. I really do. And that when people say that I love Salem's Lot, I think also, besides the wonderful, wonderful scares, I think they're saying that the scares worked because they felt involved at a gut level with the people, and that the characters convinced them. And when they say they like Rosemary's Baby, the same is true, and they responded also to the satire. Because horror has it offers great entree to social observation and to satire. I think there's a lot of fun in it.
Yeah. There's that wonderful moment in Kubrick's film where Nicholson looks through the door and says, here's Johnny. My kids run around and say that now. You know? I have a 3-year-old who goes around. Yeah. I have a 3-year-old boy who goes around saying, Daddy's not here now. The little finger thing. It's very funny. Yeah. Another thing.
He's not warped then.
Of course he's warped.
He's warped.
He's very warped. One of the things that all these genres do, I responded to what George said about if his first hit had been a jungle picture, because you take all of these things and they're genres. There's horror, there's, for instance, the crime picture, my God, can this be the end of Rico? Jungle pictures, all of these things. And what all this genre fiction does, mysteries, is they make the writer or the filmmaker tell a real story. You know, and I think in a lot of ways you just gravitate toward that idea of story. You want to tell tales.
That's very important, I think. I think that's the heart of it, really. That there's a story which can engulf you and grab your lapels the way fairy tale did when you were 6 years old.
And you can't tell a story. You can't tell a story. I mean, you can't scare anybody unless there's a story and characters for them to be involved in.
Yeah.
Scares don't exist in a vacuum.
So you're forced
Some
into
real
telling a
set.
story, as you're saying. Yeah.
Even as just now that clipboard moved and no one was near it.
Unfortunately, I was near.
Oh, you did that. Oh, okay, I feel better then. I don't know what this is relevant to, but Groucho Marx once in a Hollywood dinner introduced Spike Lee as the only man who had never made a horror movie intentionally. But anyway, well, so much for the appeal of it. We know that. I'm wondering if being exposed and immersed in the world of horror, as you are, numbs you to it in any craftsmen who are immune.
I think we scared instead of less.
Yeah.
A little in the beginning, we're in good hands. But then when we see that it's being done right, we'll go along with it more than anyone else. Really.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're less immune. You're immune to things that don't work. I think that's what you're saying, because you see exactly what they're trying to do or what isn't working about them. But when it works better for you, because you, probably basically because you're saying, gee, why didn't I think of that? But,
When those of you here who didn't write The Shining read it, did it scare you?
I was terrified by it. I thought it was a great book, and it just it bowled me over, and I was just
I pay him to say
scared to
these
death.
Thank you. That's great.
It's there are many people who feel that that book has given them the scare of their lives, and
It's funny, because when an interviewer says to me, well, what scares you? You know, this is one of the questions you come up against. I'm a little bit flabbergasted, because my immediate response is, let's try to think of something that doesn't scare me, you know, in one form or another. I can remember, for instance, my mother, when I was just a little kid, they used to have these machines in shoe stores, and you look down into the machine, and you saw your bones inside it, you know, in your shoes.
Yes.
And I had my feet in one of those machines, and she gave a scream and said, don't do that. That will give you cancer. And for weeks after, I would look at my feet to see if they'd started to rot yet, you know. And I put that in a book, and I think one of the things that you do after a while is you begin to search out the things that scared you the most and try to get rid of them, you know.
That's interesting, because obviously our first horrors come in childhood,
Exactly.
in various ways, and whether it's the older kid who convinces you that a bogeyman lives in the building that really houses a pump or something, or whatever it is. And I wondered, maybe it'd be interesting to learn in each of your cases if you had ones like that you remember that were striking, or maybe you were unusually susceptible as kids.
I was pretty susceptible, but in addition to the bogeyman outside the window, I was susceptible to war scares. I remember propaganda comic books and things like that scared the hell out of me. And I remember John Cameron Swayze announcing that the Russians had the bomb, you know, when I was first watching The Tube. Those were the things that got to me. And I remember the bombers flying over the Bronx where I grew up, and blackouts and things like that.
Yes.
And those scared the hell out of me, inordinately, I think.
I was scared by those ingeniously racist posters that showed Japanese with rat bodies coming out of sewers.
Oh, wow.
Remember those during the war in the
Yeah.
post office?
Well, these comic books had people bursting into homes and terrorizing the kids and eventually shooting everybody in the place while Dad was off at work. But those things scared the hell out of me, which is maybe why at least with my zombie films, I have a kind of a socio-political underbelly in them. You know, in other words, I don't know if I find it necessarily frivolous to just go out and be scared. I don't really, because I'm looking forward to Creepshow, which is a project that we're going to do together, and which is
Just very
scare.
Yeah, just get in there and try to scare people. That's all. That's fun. That's fun.
So, Levin, were you scared? Do you remember as a kid
I've been
what
sitting
scared
here
you?
trying to think of it, and I don't recall being scared at all. I think I was a very brave kid. I guess.
Whereas now you're scared.
Now I'm scared of everything.
I remember never being afraid of the dark. I don't know why people were, but I never understood sometimes why other kids had to sleep with the lights on.
I had to have a light.
Did you?
Yeah.
What did you think would get you if the light went on?
I didn't even really want to consider it, but what it might be, but I was sure that I would see it before it got me, and that probably my mind would crack open. I think as a kid I was really, you know, worried a lot about going over the high side and into Banana Land and never getting back. I was very afraid of that. As a kid, it wasn't so much being grabbed by something from the closet, so much as seeing it sort of coming toward me, you know, and knowing there'd be no escape.
What?
It turned out to be my father-in-law.
Your father-in-law? Good of you to admit that. Can you remember when you first read something that made your hair stand up?
Oh, I can remember something. I remember this great Bennett Cerf anthology that I got when I was about 10 called Great Tales of Terror and the Supernatural. And I really burrowed into that book, and there was some of it was so scary I could barely read it.
Yeah.
And it was a lot of fun. I remember.
I was prompted to go read the H.G. Wells version of War of the Worlds after seeing the movie. And
I love that film when I was a kid.
yeah, and the description in Wells, which of course the Wells was at first disappointing because it was nothing like the movie, but then I started to get into that, and the description of the aliens in that was the first thing that really scared me on the printed page.
Of course, Dracula. That's
Dracula.
Yeah, Dracula.
Sure.
You mean the movie?
No, the book.
The book?
book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I never read that as a
it's
kid.
that's a great thriller.
Much scarier than any of the movie versions today.
It is, isn't it? Yes, there are wonderful things in the book. You wonder why they didn't do
never
for the movie. There's a wonderful scene of that captainless boat comes ashore and a dog is seen to leap off and go into.
Right.
Yeah.
Which all those incidents have been included one time or another.
They've never
Did the
all
boat and
been
the-
put together, I don't think,
No.
in
The
one film.
Jourdan version was pretty true to
That was-
content.
yeah, I thought
but
that was the
it
best.
Yeah.
Mood. There was an interesting one with Palance a couple of
I
years
heard that was
before
good. I never saw
I've
it.
never seen that one. Now, the one that you were talking about was the one that was the PBS one, right? Louis
That was
Jourdan.
very
true to
stylish.
content. That was
Yeah.
Louis Jourdan.
Yeah,
that was a
as the
nice one.
Count.
Do you envy people who have seen ghosts, as I do?
I don't know. Not at all.
No. I do. I would wonder if for any reason you had gone out of your way to stay overnight in Longleat or one of
I think
those
we go out
well-known
of our way not to. I think.
places. I really envy people who've seen them. I can do without seeing a UFO, but I certainly would like to see a ghost.
I'd like to see a UFO.
Yeah, I'd like to.
Yeah, I'd rather see a UFO, I think,
What?
than a ghost. Yeah.
How about a ghost and a UFO?
That's an idea.
But you see, in our business, if we saw one of those things, we'd never tell anyway, because they just
First of all,
say,
they don't believe
"Oh,
it."
well, it was strong."
That's right. He's got
Both
crazy.
coming out.
Sure. Who is the market, to put it crassly, for horror? Are there age groups that you're playing to?
When I began, I had an idea that it was mainly younger people. But I don't think that's true anymore. And I think a lot of it has to do with the nature of the book. If the book is adult and sophisticated and has the elements that readers look for in fiction, then I think people of all kinds can read it. But generally, I think it's 18 to 25 or 15 to 25, something like that.
15 to 25. And can you see that in the line outside the theater? That, just
For the
In
films,
the
I
case
think
of
it's
movies,
definitely-
it's
film.
yeah.
Yeah.
Although it's a lot tougher to scare young people, I think.
Yeah.
Why is that?
It's pretty hard to shock them, which is, I think, probably one of the elements that at least has to be lurking around in there. And it's also, I think, just on an experiential level. I think the more experience you have with things, I don't know. Maybe I'm going too far off the deep end. Maybe it's just that for those of us that were around before there were all the answers that there are now, there were more fears. So maybe that.
I think young people tend to grab onto horror in a more natural way because it does have that quality of the roller coaster ride, the sort of big harmless scare. You don't see too many little old ladies getting off the bullet or Magic Mountain, that sort of thing. And there aren't very many, say, senior citizens that use their golden age of pass to go see Zombie or Piranha or something like that. They want to see something else. I think that young people can go see a horror movie or pick up a horror novel and not feel personally assaulted by it because they feel safe in their own sense of health and well-being. And at the same time, I think that a lot of kids feel like outsiders. They may feel a little monstrous themselves, and they can go see a movie like, for instance, Night of the Living Dead, and they may feel that, you know, that they have some problems with their peers or whatever it is, but the sheriff in that movie, somebody says, well, Chief, are they hard to kill? And the sheriff says, no, they're dead, they're all messed up. You know? That makes the kid feel kind of good inside. It makes them look a lot
What about the so-called moral content of horror films and books? Do you ever consciously put one in or concern yourself with that at all?
I think it's, in general, horror is almost by tradition highly moral. In fact, to the detriment of a lot of it, because people spend too much time bringing things back to a kind of normality, which possibly shouldn't have existed in the first place. But I think that it's always been viewed as allegory, and there's always a kind of a moral statement underneath it somewhere. I mean, we're always exorcising something that's either been a part of
the
us.
monster gets destroyed.
The monster gets destroyed.
Unless you want to make a sequel, then you
It's
leave it
a
out.
celebration of daily life, really. Because when the intruder comes in, or the bizarre element comes into daily life, then it's frightening, must be pushed away.
I think that one of the things that's so unsettling about Rosemary's Baby is the fact that a kind of normality surfaces again at the end that makes the reader very uneasy, because this is motherhood, and yet the child is the devil, or the son of the devil.
I do like to keep a little element unreconstructed at the end, a little of the horror still loose, because I think that makes the work sort of stay in the mind more.
Yes, I
So that all
always
the
like
knots
that.
aren't quite
when
tied
you
up.
realize there are only 30 pages left, you don't want everything to come right
Right.
again.
Rosemary's Baby was really landmark in that way, I think, in terms of
Thank you.
really turned a corner in terms of as you said, a new normality at the end, rather than what was normal in the first 20 pages, coming back to that.
When we realize what's happened, and that the child is not going to be used for a human sacrifice, as Rosemary has thought all along, at that point I begin rooting for Rosemary to throw the kid out a window. And there's that moment in the book where there's silence and Rosemary says, "You're rocking him too fast." And you say, "Oh no," because you know she's going to just take over and raise the kid. Yeah.
I couldn't help noticing that three of you are what might be termed heavy smokers. Can you relate that to fear in any way, or lack of it?
There's an obvious
lack of it, I think.
Well, I always
Self-indulgence.
tell my wife
Self-indulgence.
that anybody can quit smoking, but it takes a real man to face lung cancer.
Does she believe that?
No, neither do I.
Some of your warps are still with you. Well, there's some formula, I can never remember which way it goes, that tragedy is pessimistic optimism and comedy is optimistic pessimism, or is it the other way around? Is horror writing optimistic finally?
Yes,
Stanley
yes, I think
Kubrick
it
made an
is.
interesting remark in, somewhere that he had to think a minute, and then he said, well, the fact that there are ghosts in so much of it indicates that it at least points to survival of death, and that's optimistic, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know.
But usually, unless the author is unduly perverse, the heroine survives, or the hero, and is a better person for the experience.
Yeah. It's optimistic. It's affirming, really.
Yeah.
Most of them, when you come down to the conclusion.
That London can survive Dracula.
Right.
You'd think maybe that humor would not be compatible with horror, but everybody knows, I guess, the opposite is true. One of the scariest movies I ever saw was not one of the supposedly scary movies, but was Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein.
That was a wonderful movie.
There were some really chilling moments in
It's
there.
very frightening.
Yeah.
I think, well, Hitchcock says you have to follow all that tension with a good laugh. I think you can shuffle it right in there and put them in the same stew, you know.
I think it allows it to breathe, you know.
Yeah.
There's an air hole in there.
Well, if you go see a horror movie and something really frightening happens, the audience will scream, but always following that scream is this nervous laughter, which says to your seatmate, I screamed mostly because I needed a stretch in my chest. I wasn't really scared. And so they work together.
There's a big difference, too, between startle creating real fear. And most of the effect, and again, I'm talking movies more than you guys have a lot tougher time because you don't have sound and you can't make something jump out. But it's a lot easier to startle people with film. And unfortunately, you see a lot of that. You see a lot of films that rely almost totally on that kind of thing. And that's always the nervous laughter kind of, that's the real laugh-in-the-dark experience, you know, what jumps out of the next corner.
Yeah. That doesn't
Very
count,
different.
does it? It doesn't count. It's too easy.
It's very easy. And
Anybody can do that just by cutting the right way.
yeah, a quick movement synchronized
But it's
with
very
a loud
tempting.
sound.
It's very
Oh, it's great. I mean, it's part of the traditional experience, and, you know, and it's great fun. Dawn of the Dead is really just that. I mean, Dawn of the Dead, if there's any kind of an fear experience that comes off it, it's much subtler or more intellectual. Other than that, it's just kind of a celebration of that kind of experience. Because that is fun. I mean, that's...
Yeah.
That's interesting, what you can do in a film and can't. I think it's a Polanski film in which a character moves the bathroom medicine chest mirror, and just for an instant it registers that someone is standing in the room over here, and it gives me goosepimples as I think of it. Now, could you write that same thing and get the same effect?
That thing, I think you could. There are other things that I don't think you can do very effectively. There's that thing that De Palma does at the end of the film of Carrie, where the hand shoots out of the ground and grabs Amy Irving, and it's not in the book, and I think if it was in the book that it would have nowhere near the effect that it has in the movie.
Reading the words, suddenly a hand shot out of the ground, is not as scary as...
That's right.
Or you'd have to do it another way, perhaps. Yeah, it'd be an interesting exercise, wouldn't it, to
Exorcise.
exorcise. We have to get that pun out of here. Exorcise it. Well, there's a lot more to talk about, and we're going to have to talk about a lot more of it next time. So, to George Romero, Peter Straub, Ira Levin, and Stephen King, and myself, will join you tomorrow night. Are you afraid to join us? Don't be afraid. Welcome back. We thought this was the appropriate season to get together some masters of horror. Not the people who act it, but the people who create it on both the printed page and on the silver screen. So that's what we have done, and it's been most interesting. And I hope you saw last night's show. If you didn't, I will reintroduce to you the gentlemen surrounding me. And they seem to be moving closer somehow. Who's the first to use the forest moving in closer? Anyway, will you welcome, please, the author of Carrie and The Shining, Mr. Stephen King. And next, I'd like you to meet the director of the classic films, cult classic films, Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead, among others, Mr. George Romero. The author of Rosemary's Baby, The Stepford Wives, Boys from Brazil, and the play, The Death Trap, Mr. Ira Levin. And finally, the man who wrote Ghost Story, Julia, has a new book called Shadowland, Peter Straub. That's my panel of horror producers. You know, there's an author that I don't hear much about, and is not very well known, I think, and if I had to pick one story that I read at an impressionable age that scared the hell out of me, it would be The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood. And I can remember right where I sat when I read it, and how I, what's the two-bit word for when your hair stands up? Horripilate.
My goodness.
I horripilated. S.J. Perelman uses that. And you all know that story?
I do.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
remember it vaguely.
Is he a well-known... The Wendigo is a spirit of the North Woods, and the idea of it didn't sound promising when somebody described it to me, and I think it would scare me today if I read it. Do you all have favorite writers, not among those here? We assume these are all your favorites as well.
Of horror?
Yeah, you think there are masters that should...
Well, I always go back to Dracula and Bram Stoker.
Uh-huh.
I think that is the masterpiece of the genre.
Yeah. It's a silly question, I suppose, but did he write anything else?
Some short stories and a few other novels that didn't have anywhere near the impact. But that's why I named The House and Rosemary's Baby the Bramford, for Bram Stoker.
Never thought of that. Never thought of it. Anyone else have a particular favorite writer who's guaranteed to scare you, or did at an impressionable age?
I think if you read M.R. James at the right age, he can be very scary. He's a little stuffy for a modern taste. His language is a little old-fashioned. And there's always Lovecraft.
H.P. Lovecraft.
H.P. Lovecraft.
That's another one.
He's hard to read as an adult, I think. But,
Yeah.
The Lurking Fear and other stories.
Yeah.
Yes, that's got to me. But it's a special kind of weirdness that you either have to
You have
dig
to
or not.
really be ready for that, too. You have to be ready to sit down with that and sort of take that experience from those kinds of...
You have to take as much to Lovecraft, I think, as Lovecraft will bring to you. And if you can do that, you're pretty successful. I liked a guy named Richard Matheson. I think that he was the first guy that I ever read as a teenager who seemed to be doing something that Lovecraft wasn't doing. It wasn't Eastern Europe. It was like the horror could be in the 7-Eleven store down the block, or it could be, you know, just up the street. Something terrible could be going on, even in a GI Bill type ranch a development near a college. That it could be there as well. And to me, as a kid, that was a revelation. That was extremely exciting. He was putting the horror in places that I could relate to.
Did he write I Am Legend?
Yeah, I Am Legend and
I've always been told to read that, and I never...
And The Shrinking
Hell House is
Man.
extraordinary. And The Shrinking Man.
Yeah.
But sort of in that time, in that the early 50s, was particularly in American...
Robert Bloch.
Yeah, but that's when we as Americans started to sort of blame ourselves for things.
Yeah.
And that's when the horror came home. It no longer was from Transylvania. It was, you know...
Yeah.
I mean, once in a while it came from the outer reaches, but preyed on us. Because I'm speaking from an American perspective, but I think that was one of the... Matheson was one of the first people that was really...
Of course, one of the things that Matheson did that's got to be a classic is that story about the fellow who's just driving upstate in California and the truck gets on his tail. And you never see the driver, you never know exactly what his trip is, but he's trying to murder this fellow who's played in the movie by Dennis Weaver with an oil tanker truck. Very frightening. Spielberg, that wasn't that
Spielberg. That was Spielberg's
Yeah.
first film. It was that's the pure thing too. It's
Really?
right on target.
Duel. Is that Duel?
Duel.
Yeah.
If a book is good, I almost never care where the author got the idea. It doesn't interest me. But in this case, I know that part of survival for you is coming up with ideas. To me, that would be the toughest part. It's a field that's been worked and worked.
Yeah.
Do you mind telling where some of the ideas come from?
I've gotten most of mine from things I've read. Newspaper articles, nonfiction books, something will spark.
Can you think of an
the
example
idea.
of where one of your...
Well, the Stepford Wives, I got the idea for that reading Future Shock, Alvin Toffler's book. There's a section in there on domestic robots, and he speculates on how well they will work. And I said, well, suppose they work very well.
that was all you needed.
Right. Then a couple of years to think about it.
Really, a couple of years of putting down ideas?
I find with me an idea has to stew for a long time.
And with The Shining, can you point to...
Well, that was a case where I had half an idea that I got from reading Ray Bradbury. And I think from the Dark Carnival stories, and about a little boy. Bradbury's got a story called The Veldt, which is set in the future, and there's a nursery where the walls your mind projects movies on these walls. And at the end of the story, the monsters inside the walls come alive and eat up the parents who go inside.
Lions and tigers.
Yeah,
yeah.
lions and tigers and bears, oh my. And it seemed to me that, okay, let's have a kid who can make things real. That was half of the idea. And then my wife and I were in Colorado, and we went up to a hotel called the Stanley in Estes Park, and I said, this is the place. And when I had the place to go with the, you know, the idea of the little boy, everything came together. And really, I'd had half of that idea just sort of kicking around inside for maybe 2 years or something, not knowing exactly where the drive shaft was for that.
That's something I've found, and I think it probably applies to all writers, not just in this genre, but every really good idea is the coming together of two half ideas. So if suddenly you realize that you've been thinking about Project A and Project M, and if you put those two together, suddenly there's a spark.
And sometimes I think you don't quite realize how parasitic it is to work, particularly in a genre like this, because the things that made impressions on you that you read or that you saw are in very often impressions that are really deeply in there somewhere. And I know I find, particularly with the filmic style, that I very often catch myself being parasitic of some. You mentioned the moment with the mirror in the Polanski film. You know, those things lay in the back of your head, and you walk on the set and you see something and you decide, well, how about I light it this way and shoot it this way? And you realize, and all of a sudden, oh, I've seen this before.
But don't you think, too, George, that it's a really narrow sort of field, and you can't help but step on other people's feet or go over what other people have done? Don't you think that's true?
I think it is, yeah. Well, I Am Legend really is what, and I wrote Night of the Living Dead because I read I Am Legend, I think, and I just wanted to, I know I wanted to just lay a little more socio-political stuff into that and make it very frontal and overt, because rather than just a pure terror piece. And I know that somewhere in the back of my mind it came from that, from having read that and saying, wait, that's not exactly, you know, this is more like what it should be. You know, and it comes from a kind of a conviction, I think, of knowing that, well, I can accomplish one of two things. I can be scary in this way, and I can tell that story, which is what you were saying before. Once you have the guidelines, you can your tendency is to tell the story in a streamlined way, because you don't ramble as much. You keep bringing it back to that, whatever it is that's going to target, hopefully, the audience in onto something that's going to be frightening.
Do you believe in any of these things? Do you believe the people who have seen weird things happen? Do you believe in, is it called telekinesis or telekinesis? The person who can clear a bookshelf of books by his mind, or cause the ashtray to leap from the table.
Cause the prom.
Yeah, I don't believe or disbelieve. I've always thought that there is such a body of evidence now from people who have no good cause to lie that almost surely, I say almost surely, things of that nature do go on from time to time, but I don't think that anybody has any real control over it. But until I actually see something myself, I got to say I'm just sort of an agnostic that leans toward a certain amount of belief.
On the other hand, Steve, haven't you had people come up to you and tell you about ghosts they have seen? Yeah. And they're not liars, and they seem perfectly reasonable, rational people.
That's right.
And you think, if this guy has seen it, you know, there is something there.
That's right.
Something, in fact, has happened.
And they don't want anything, do they?
They don't want anything.
What they want to do is tell you, because they think that you're a kindred spirit.
Yeah.
You suppose this is a real fly? Or Vincent Price?
So we know we have a spider here.
Yeah, now we have a small... Yes, I don't like to contribute to the fear of spiders, because most of them are our friends, and someone threw that up here. But that fly is very...
The fly is quite interesting.
It's avoiding the spider.
It knows something. What's the greatest compliment you can get?
If someone tells you that they couldn't sleep, or that they had nightmares, you know, they had nightmares for a week, I think that's a great compliment.
Proud of that, huh?
Oh, that's wonderful.
So there is a little sadism or sadism or sadism.
Well, you know, it worked.
Yeah, well, that's what they wanted.
It was efficient.
Yeah. Somebody, Kingsley Amis, the British writer, said that, what's MacDonald's first name? Who writes the titles that always have a color in
John
them,
D.
like,
John D. MacDonald.
John D. MacDonald, yeah. That his book is worth any number of Saul Bellows or something. I don't know what the, and what he dismissed as the other true to the human heart boys. The idea being, I guess, that for one thing, this is not a genre to be ashamed of, although many people would say highbrow people don't really read that stuff. Do you ever feel defensive that you have to justify being in this field that is not quite up to, say, Henry James, even though...
Well, yeah, in fact, of course, Henry James wrote wonderful ghost stories, and Edith Wharton wrote wonderful ghost stories. But the field is so filled with junk at the moment that it's the sub-basement of writing. But actually, instead of being defensive, I think one should be happy about it, because you can do anything you can think of, and nobody at the Partisan Review is going to notice. You can get away with everything.
Worry about them. I think it's one of the men sitting here, as a publisher said, that he is, in fact, simply the biggest selling author in the world. Would it embarrass him if I pointed him out?
No, I wouldn't. That's all right. It's all right.
You wouldn't mind that at all? And I know you have a cult following to the point where when your name appears on the screen, it gets a hand in the credits. I'm told that people are just so grateful to the way you've terrorized
My
them.
children of the night. What lovely music they make. People like to be scared. As far as being defensive, I think the first thing that you have to get over is that that immediate reaction, well, just how weird are you? Are you all right? Can you be taken out in company? What are you going to do? What have you done?
Sure.
That sort of thing. And when you get around that, then I think in most cases, people will accept you as a rational man who does sort of an irrational thing. In his spare time, Robert Bloch, who wrote Psycho, said that he, of course, one of the things that Bloch said that I always loved was he said he really had the heart of a small boy. He kept it in a jar on his desk. But, you know, he said that the writer of this sort of thing is a Jekyll and Hyde. He's a werewolf creation, and you're good to your children, and you're good to your wife, and you answer your mail, and you don't snarl at the milkman. It's just that when you go in the study, you put on that other face.
Yeah.
I've known George Romero for, what, 2.5 years, I guess now. And George really is the nicest fellow that you would ever want to meet. He's big-hearted, warm, kind, all of that stuff. I get paid for this. But, you know, you put on that face and you're going after people. We talked about Creepshow, this project that we're involved in. And this is not a plug or anything like that. The idea is, when we talked about it, we talked about a lot of ideas. And George would kind of go, well, yeah. And George would say something, and I'd say, yeah, but... And we started to talk about this concept, and the idea was just to get people into a movie theater, close the doors, and see if we couldn't get them to actually crawl out with jujubes and popcorn in their hair from hiding under the seats. And his eyes lit up, and mine did, and it was like jackpot, because that's what you want to do. And if you're going to do it, you ought to go do it.
It's sort of instead of kicking the chair.
That's right.
Does anyone remember the Tingler?
Oh, yes.
And am I right or wrong about this? That someplace they had the idea of, and did in fact install some little electric device in some of the seats which reached out and grabbed people or gave them a zest.
A little electric shock.
About
mild electric shock.
That was William Castle who produced that film, and he bought Rosemary's Baby, and I was not overjoyed when he did. And I remember the day when he called and said that he had decided not to direct it himself. He was getting Roman Polanski, and was I terribly unhappy? And I said, no, I think I could get over that.
He did all of those gimmick things. Yeah. Remember the fright break in Homicidal? There's all of a sudden, as the movie approaches its climax, a big clock comes on the screen, and then the announcer says, "This is the fright break." And if you're weak of heart, you're supposed to get out of of the theater, you have 60 seconds to do it. And then there was the House on Haunted Hill, which had the skeleton that came out of the little, drifted
that
out
was a
over
real vision or something, and it was dropped because at a screening, the skeleton fell on an executive's head. And so it was kind of dropped. But he was also the guy who had you do an insurance policy in the lobby. That was before Macabre.
That's a nice idea. Too.
Yeah, I was about 10 then. All my friends called it McBear. And that was the big movie. Everybody wanted to go see McBear that summer because you had to sign an insurance policy, and if you croaked, you got thousands.
It was almost worth it.
Almost.
I often wonder, when you're reading a really good and complicated thriller or horror book, you think, if my life depended on it, I couldn't figure out how to end this, or where it's going, or what's going to explain what's going on. Does anyone ever write that way, by writing themselves into a corner and then figuring out a way out, the way some magicians will decide what effect they want and then figure out a way to do it?
I always have to know where I'm going to end. I don't know how I'm going to get there, but I have to at least have the end in mind. And then I sort of take a chance on being able to find my way there.
Yeah. Would Rosemary be an example of that? Did you?
Yeah,
was there some point in the middle where you didn't know what the resolution would be, or?
No,
or
I really couldn't get started on it until I knew that she was going to accept the baby at the end. But then I didn't much care about the middle because I figured I would take care of it when I got there, and I did.
Yeah.
But I couldn't start. I literally could not begin it, and I realized that it was because I wasn't sure how it was going to end. And once I made up my mind on that.
It seems like one thing that would separate the good from the bad, either in film or fiction, is obviously the ending. Is it a disappointment at the end, and you know, I've been had all along?
Well, again, that depends. As you say, if you know really where you're going. I think that, for example, the ending in The Birds was disappointing to a lot of people.
I didn't remember what the ending was.
They just sort of go out of the house and drive off to get Tippi Hedren to the hospital, and then there are birds all over the place, and they just sort of drive away. And a lot of people felt there was really no resolve to that until people started to dig into it a little bit and find out what the attitudes of the film were towards the whole idea of family and all that.
How did the story, isn't it from de Maupassant's story?
De Maupassant.
Or something like that?
Du Maurier.
I always get them confused. They look so much alike. Do you ever base your characters on real people, even relatives or friends?
I think that most writers, not just horror writers, do that to a degree, and I found myself in a lot of cases stewing together 2 or 3 people that I may have met or I may have seen to make a completely new character. It's a little bit like those flip books that my kids have, where you can make 1,000 different faces from, you know, 3 series of segments. You know, the hairline and the eyes and the rest. So, and usually that works pretty well. And then every now and then you will see somebody that you don't know, and you'll just say, "What's this guy about?" And then the character becomes a kind of adventure as you try to figure out exactly who they are and what they're doing. Hitchcock was a great one at that. Wonderful character studies there in those films.
What about the erotic side of it? To some people, fear itself is an erotic stimulant.
I think there's an erotic subcurrent in most supernatural fiction, and then maybe some of the fear is a sexual fear.
Yeah.
But I don't think Stephen King has ever written a sex scene in a book. Have you? I don't remember any.
Well, I'm trying, Peter. I need more experience.
They're not.
There's an
anybody's
eroticism
willing,
in Salem's Lot, I find.
Yeah.
I find.
But you know, in a way...
But no Harold Robbins kind of.
Yeah.
Oh, no,
we
no,
were
no,
talking
no.
about Dracula earlier, and Dracula is a tremendously sexy book.
Yeah.
And, of course, Salem's Lot came from my wife saying one night at supper, I was teaching that book in high school, and she said, "What do you suppose it would be like if Dracula came back today?" And it was one of those ideas that you'd forget about it for a while, and it would pop back up. And one of the decisions that I made in that book pretty consciously was to use a little bit of that, but not to try and use that sexual subcurrent a lot, because I thought in a world where we've got not only the Penthouse Forum, but God help us, Penthouse Variations and every other thing, that in a way that might be an empty car now. That a lot of the sex that was in Dracula came from a repressed society.
Yeah.
Of saying this is okay, it's all right for this man to come into your bedroom and give you a hickey in the middle of the night because he's a vampire and you can't help yourself. It's okay.
Well, there are people who theorize that that repression and oppression are really at the root of all of the horror experience, totally, and related to very closely to a repressed sexual. You know, I don't know whether you were saying before that some of the stuff that's been written about why horror is
It's pretty ludicrous,
goes over
I
the
think.
edge.
Yeah.
But
How does this enter into the rating system of a film, whether it gets an R or...
well,
Does it ever get an X for
recently,
horror? And not?
recently the rating system, as we presently know it, has been rating violence as toughly, if you will, as they rate sex. It's
Is there a difference? So if two monsters cut each other's heads off, that would seem to be more okay than if two normal people do.
well, I feel that it's more okay, or I don't feel that it's as traumatizing. I also happen to think that whether it be sex, violence, whatever, that they should be. Well, rated is an unfortunate word, but maybe there should be at least information passed out to the audience which says this contains this, language, whatever. I think that unfortunately the rating system in this country, thank God it's something short of censorship, but it's confusing. X-rated as a phrase has entered our vocabulary as meaning sex or having a sexual connotation. And unfortunately the X rating is not copyrighted. It's not a copyrighted trademark, as the PG, the G, and the R are. So the X was kind of thrown out there for people who were making motel movies. Anybody can use it, and you're not infringing on anyone's copyright. So there are problems with the rating system and everything. But yes, they are Xing violence. Dawn of the Dead was probably would have been an X, but we went out without a rating, simply because we felt that it would have been confusing to put an X on a picture. We put information on all of the advertising material which said this film is very violent and everything else, but we didn't want people to confuse it as having a sexual or a purely sexual content. It has no sex in it at all, actually. Overt sex.
No overt sex.
Maybe sex between monsters would be all right. Do you get weirdo mail?
Sex
Oh,
between
Dracula.
monsters?
Dracula is
Bride of Frankenstein.
Bride of Frankenstein. There.
But that doesn't come off. The two of them don't get along at all.
No.
She begins to scream when she sees him. It's true.
We all know how that feels.
Well, we always suspect that Dracula is off there with those women from the basement.
Yeah, but you know, this is no pun intended. I don't want to go into this too deeply, but the sex in most vampire stories is all a kind of oral thing. It's all a kissing thing. In the novel, we have no idea that he's certainly a great lover. He almost seems dead from, let's say, the throat down.
Those parts were censored out back in that Victorian age that you were talking about.
I believe he has a mustache in the novel, which bothered me because I wanted to picture Bela Lugosi as I read it, and he never did. Do you get strange mail?
I do. I do.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure we all do.
Yeah. One does seem to attract the strange letter writers.
What sort of strange mail?
Well, I get asked if I can put people in touch with covens of witches, and if I can explain mysterious events that have taken place on the other side of the world.
I can remember getting a letter from a fellow who wanted to come up. He said he had a magic Polaroid camera, and he standing behind me in a diminishing line. It would be my father, my grandfather, his, on and on, presumably back to primordial. I don't answer that sort of letter.
Probably just as well. As a filmmaker, do you get...
Sure, pretty much the same kind of thing. Again, I think, as Peter mentioned, and what you're talking about with people that write about strange Polaroids, people do expect you to be kindred spirits. So most of the strange, I've never gotten any sort of hate mail or anything like that. It's usually the strangest things are people who expect that you're going to understand where no one else will.
That's right.
And
Ira and I met a guy, well, we tried not to meet him. The fellow who said he could tell the future by not by using ESP. You remember that?
He had another way of
He had a
predicting the
technique,
future.
and he told Ira there was a sure this thing. A great book could be made of it someday.
We hurried off.
We scurried away.
Obviously, if he'd been any good, he'd have known you were going to run off.
Right. That was exactly right.
I'm sorry, we're out of time. Again, thank you, gentlemen, for being here. And George Romero, Peter Straub, Ira Levin, and Stephen King. The fly has gone into my head. It's you talk strangely. And I'm Dick Cavett. We'll see you next time. Good night.